Բարի երեկո սիրելիներ։ Շատ շնորհակալություն ձեր ներկայության համար։ Այսօր հայագիտական ուսման ծրագիրը պատիվ ունի հյուրընկալելու Dr. Ara Sanjian-ը. Hello and welcome to the Programme of Armenian Studies second academic event of 2018. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Ara Sanjian for accepting our invitation and coming to speak to us today about the thorny socio-economic issue of land reform and how it was tackled by the government of the new Republic of Armenia during the 30 months of its existence. Dr. Sanjian is the Associate Professor of Armenian and Modern Middle Eastern History and the Director of the Armenian Research Center at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. From 1991 to 1994, Ara studied for his PhD in Modern History of the Middle East at the School of Oriental and African Studies. His wealth of experience includes being chairman of the Department of Armenian Studies, History and Political Science at Haigazan University in Beirut, and being the Henry Kazan Visiting Professor in Armenian Studies at the California State University, Fresno. Ara joined the University of Michigan Dearborn in January 2006. His research interests focus on the post-World War I history of Armenia, Turkey, and the Arab states of Western Asia. He is the author of Turkey and Her Arab Neighbors, 1953 to 1958, a study in the origins and failure of the Baghdad Pact, 2001, it was published in, as well as 2 monographs and several scholarly articles and book chapters, published in English, Armenian, Russian, and French. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Sanjian to speak to us today. Thank you.
Good evening, and well, I was not studying here because this building was not there yet. We were told that an unknown, although we know who he was, somebody would build a building, so I was in the other building when I was a student here. But in my previous visit, the building was already in place. I will be talking about the short-lived independent Republic of Armenia, whose centennial Armenians are marking almost this week. And this did play a role in choosing the topic, saying that since my visit will coincide at the time of the centennial, let's have something also dealing with that period. And I've just been to 2 conferences in the United States where the issue was discussed again, and understandably there is some interest on that period because of the ongoing centennial. And I want to raise here a few issues which are a bit different from the mainstream. If we look back to the historiography of this short-lived republic, which survived for 30 months from late May 1918 to early December 1920, most of the focus had been to look at the history of this brief period from the prism of nationalism and state building and international relations. Basically, it's relations with Russia and the Western powers, or the Russias. Probably that's a better word, because there were many Russias at the time until the Bolsheviks basically knocked all of the others out one by one. And then, of course, these territorial disputes with its neighbors, the Ottoman Empire, which later on became Kemalist Turkey, with Georgia and Azerbaijan. So most of what you will read about the history of the Republic will basically be focusing on these issues. I will focus on something which has been given less attention. I will not say totally neglected, no, but certainly never comes up in, more popular histories of the Republic, which is its agrarian side. Because we should remember that Republic of Armenia in 1918 was an 80% agrarian country. 80% of its population consisted of peasants. Plus, of course, many of the refugees who ended up coming from the Ottoman Empire were of peasant origin themselves. So this was a very important social and economic issue at the time. And through this case study, we can look into the ideologies that were prevalent in the Republic at the time. We can divide them very roughly into 2 blocks with their subdivisions: a socialist bloc of ideologies, which a number of parties basically followed, and also there were democratic liberal parties at the same time. And I will talk about how each one of them looked at the agrarian question during this lecture. And something which will come up during the lecture, and I will return it again later on, is that we see that how much the ruling elite of the Republic felt connected to the revolution that had taken place in Russia in February 1917. This has been neglected later on because for the Soviet regime, the real revolution was in October 1917 and not in February 1917. And once in exile, these issues were not of great importance, even for those leaders who had espoused these ideas during the short Republic period. So I will come back again at the very end of the lecture about analyzing how these issues became neglected because of the changing circumstances. This is a very good case again of how context creates historiography, and historiography is never independent of the context within which it actually emerges. The sources that I used to do this research are basically of two major types. One are the state archives of the Republic of Armenia, which are housed in the National Archives of Armenia in Yerevan, and I used material that was in the files of the parliament, the government, and the Ministry of what was called Agriculture and State Properties. I also went through many of the newspapers and other periodicals that were published in Armenia and in the surrounding regions between 1917 and 1920. The newspapers that I have consulted were published in Yerevan, Echmiadzin, Kars, Shushi, Baku, Tiflis, and Akhaltsikhe. But ever since this research was completed, I have not published it yet, but it's there basically in a quite advanced stage. Many of these things have already also been digitized. So many of these newspapers, which were only available if you visited the libraries, and I used what was then the Armenian National Library, previously the Miasnigian Public Library in Armenia, in Yerevan, and also the Maintaran collection. Now, most of it, maybe 95% of what I saw, is already digitized, and you can access it through the site Karahavak on the internet. So technically, this is the area that we are talking about, and technically, this was the map of the Russian Empire just before the outbreak of World War I, and most of the Armenians lived in the Yerevan gubernia or province or governorate, the exact translation will be, and of course that became the core of the future territory of Armenia. But there were also Armenians in the neighboring administrative regions of Kars, Elizavetpol, and Tiflis as well. And before World War I, which broke out in 1914, the land program was very acute inside the whole of the Russian Empire, including in Transcaucasia, the area which is now covered by the republics of Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. There was acute socio-economic stratification in the region and a deepening problem of peasants suffering from insufficient arable land. And so most political parties, which were already becoming legal in the later stages of Tsarist Russia, did have ideas about how that problem should be solved. The Tsarist government recognized it was an acute problem. It had its own vision of how it should be solved. And of course, when the revolution happened, this whole problem was bequeathed by the forces that took control of the state after the demise of the Tsarist Empire. But in the meantime, World War I really affected Transcaucasia quite a lot, because one of the fronts was in Transcaucasia, although the Russians basically had the better of the Ottoman armies, and few of the fighting actually happened on former Russian territory. Most of it happened on former Ottoman territory. But of course, because of the Armenian genocide and other political dislocations, a lot of people actually sought refuge inside the Russian territories. We're talking about 100,000 or more refugees who came into the Yerevan province and even further east or further north later on. In the area, we see a sharp reduction in the area of cultivated land, decrease in agricultural production, decrease in the number of domesticated animals, inflation, increasing social inequality, plus all the refugees. So technically, the issue of how to handle the agrarian issue became even more acute because of these developments. Then came, of course, the revolution in Russia. And as you all know, there were two revolutions in Russia in 1917. First, we are going to talk about the first one, and for us, the more important one ideologically, the one which occurred in February, by new style, March 1917. And when the news of the revolution came to Transcaucasia, most liberal democratic and socialist parties in Transcaucasia welcomed it. So all of the political factions that we're going to talk about, all of them were happy with the downfall of the Tsar, but of course they had different visions of how quick the social changes should occur after the demise of the Tsar. And initially, most of these parties pledged loyalty to the new provisional government, which appeared in the Russian capital, then Petrograd, it's today St. Petersburg, and also to the committee that government appointed in Transcaucasia, with headquarters in Tiflis, the Special Transcaucasian Committee, which was more like an executive body which was appointed to govern the region without much legislative power until the convening of the All-Russian Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly was thought to be the panacea to all of Russia's problems. The idea was there that there should be empire-wide elections, and then, of course, delegates should be sent to Petrograd, where a Constituent Assembly would meet probably for weeks and months in order to write a new constitution for the country. And initially, the whole idea was just be patient until the Constituent Assembly will deal with all these problems. The land reform issue was also considered to be empire-wide, not only in Transcaucasia, but all across the Russian Empire, as one of the important issues that had to be solved through the Constituent Assembly. So, in this context, all that the provisional government did initially was to establish what was called the Chief Land Committee, which would have its subordinate land committees at the provincial, district, and precinct level. And its job was basically not legislative. It had to just collect the necessary information on the needs of the population, prepare a draft law, which would be studied at the Constituent Assembly, and settle land disputes until the convening of the Constituent Assembly. So basically the idea was for the peasants, be patient. The most important change has already occurred. The Tsars are no longer in power, and basically soon all your problems will be solved. So it was that kind of a situation, very similar to what we hear by the government in Armenia in the past couple of weeks, that, just be patient and everything will be fine. It's that kind of a message that was being disseminated. And the OZACOM, that's of course the Russian abbreviation of the Special Transcaucasian Committee, stayed in power between March and November 1917. It created a temporary committee on land affairs, with subordinate land committees at the provincial, county, district, and village levels, and also later on decided to set up an elected Transcaucasian Regional Land Committee and subordinate elected land committees. But of course, I think these elections did never actually occur, and so technically the issue was deferred. But in this atmosphere where everybody was getting ready for the Constituent Assembly, what we see in Transcaucasia, like other areas of the Russian Empire, are a series of conferences. Conferences by region, conferences by trade and specialization, and conferences by various political parties. And they will give us a broad map of what was suggested. If we bring it down into a minimum, what was suggested as far as basic land reform could be divided into three concepts. One was called municipalization, and its major advocates were the social democratic Mensheviks. The Armenian Chagians supported, but the Armenian Chagians were a very, very small group with very little actual influence on the events. The nationalization of land, which was suggested by the social democratic Bolsheviks, and also the socialization of land, which was adopted by the socialist revolutionaries in Russia, and the Armenian Tashnak Party or the Armenian Revolutionary Federation actually had adopted the same program for it as its own program even before that February Revolution. We're going to talk about that. I will not go into very much about the details of this. In the Armenian field, because the Dashnaks were the dominant, so basically it was socialization. And socialization, I will give it in more detail when I describe the Tashnak Party program. Municipalization is another form of nationalization, but it really gives more power to the elected municipal authorities. While in socialization, it's the village communes that will decide. So those who were for socialization usually said they were afraid that municipalization will lead into too much government bureaucratic interference. And their argument was that socialization would leave actually the villagers inside the villages in charge of their own affairs, of course with the government giving some kind of guidance. The Bolshevik nationalization, of course, initially was not implemented at all, but even when the Bolsheviks came to the power, they made a lot of concessions to socialization. We can talk about that later on. So essentially here we're going to talk about municipalization and socialization. Whenever the meeting was majority Armenian, so the Dashnaks were the largest group, and all the decisions that they passed were for socialization. Whenever the meetings were at the level of Transcaucasia, the Mensheviks come in, and basically they get solutions in favor of municipalization. However, at the end of the day, even in Georgia, municipalization was not actually implemented, while we see that in Armenia, actually there was no kind of law of reform that occurred, although a lot of debate happened, and we are going to focus on that. So, to start with the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, it was established in 1890, and by the early 20th century, it was probably the most effective Armenian political party, especially in Russian Armenia as well. And in their 1907 program, the Dashnaks adopted the socialist revolutionary approach of socialization of land as their objective in both Ottoman and Russian Armenia. What did they demand? And this is basically a rephrasing of that section of party's program. Is first, abolition of private land ownership. However, private ownership of other means of production will be respected, like tools or animals or whatever that the peasants may actually own. It's only land that cannot be owned privately. A permanent ban on the sale of land. Land cannot be sold and bought. It can only be redistributed. The confiscation of large estates belonging to the state, to the church, and large private landowners, and their immediate free distribution to the peasantry. The problem here was church, and we'll come to that as well later on, because in the Armenian case, the largest landowner was the church. Thereafter, after this land fund has been created through basically abolishing private ownership, what you have to do is that village and town communes would regulate the use of the socialized land. Each family would receive as much land as it could cultivate on its own, and farmhands could only be employed if the composition of the family was unfavorable. Like, for example, if the husband dies, the wife may actually hire somebody to do the work until the kids, for example, grow up. That would not be considered to be exploitation or things like that. Or for quick casual work, but not long term. Or in some areas where agricultural work for pressure industrial crops could not be postponed. So there will be very serious limitations on how you can employ labor in order to continue with agricultural work. Now, the size of land allotments would vary from one region to another, depending on how much it was available, and then secondly, what the needs were. For example, if it needs artificial irrigation, probably then you will have smaller plots. If basically you have to rely on rain, then probably the plots will be bigger, issues like this. Special taxes would be imposed to eventually equalize the sizes of these allotments. So the eventual goal is equalization. Central and regional administrations would distribute land at regular intervals, every 5 to 7 years, so that various regions and communes would continue having equal access to it. Of course, in villages, the size of the families will be taken into consideration as they constantly change because of death and new birth and new marriages and new families coming up. So this was basically the socialist revolutionary perception which the Tashnaks fully adopted. Now, of course, Armenian Mensheviks were very few, and they were for municipalization. And Armenian Bolsheviks were also very few, and also they favored nationalization. But among the liberal democratic wing, we have a new political party emerging in Armenia in the spring of 1917. And that party was called the Armenian People's Party, which was the Armenian version or the Armenian equivalent of the Russian Cadet Party. These are, for those who know Western Armenian history, the Eastern Armenian equivalents of the Ramgavar Party. So basically they are considered to be the bourgeois people, although they refused that label, but that's how they were identified by the others. And essentially, although the party was new, many of the people who joined the party, especially in Tiflis, were very well-established figures in the community. So although the party's following was small, the expertise that it could render, and we'll talk about this, to actually governing the area was big, because we're talking here about that educated, well-off elite, etc., which can contribute more per individual rather than the poorer villagers and the others. The populists were committed to the principle of private land ownership, especially for smallholders. So those villagers who had small plots would keep their small plots as private property. They were also against the sale of and purchase of land, and that's very interesting. And they were for some limited redistribution because they realized that there was some problems and some people, peasants were landless, so we can actually expropriate the lands of the gentry, those who have a lot, as well as the state, as well as private estates belonging to individuals, etc., which are very big, and give some of that to the poorer peasants. However, they wanted the government to do that, and not for free, but actually by paying what was considered to be a fair, not a market price, and then, of course, giving that amount to the poor peasants. So in a way, it will not be a total confiscation like the socialists actually envisaged. But when it came to the land belonging to the Armenian Church, the Armenian populists stood with the church and said the Armenian Church lands should not be confiscated at all, because all the revenue is used for education and charitable purposes. And so if you take away all those lands from the church, all those parish schools, and all the activities that the Catholic state in Echmiadzin did will be hampered, because they would not have anything to do. Of course, later on the Bolsheviks did that, and you know what poor state Echmiadzin found itself in, basically without people from outside Armenia sending money to Echmiadzin. Basically, Echmiadzin was broke. In a way, but of course, in order not to have something like that, they were actually suggesting that this should be out. But this issue was never resolved, and not everybody agreed with them. Many Armenians did think that no, the church's land estates should also be expropriated. But that issue was not resolved up until the Bolsheviks came and sovietized the country. Another problem which comes up at this early stage, when people are just debating what they should do, is the intertwining of the national issues, local self-government, and land reform. Transcaucasia had mixed population. Yes, there were 3 main nationalities developing at the time, but there were also others. But even when we would only take the major 3, not all of them lived basically harmoniously in compact areas, but basically there were lots of areas where the population was mixed. And the Tashnaks and also the populists said that gradually when we are redistributing land, we should try to make, various groups try to live together in more compact manner, and that basically also should help local self-government, so that local self-government will not be in more than one language, but in different languages. It's easy to say that, of course, when you actually have to divide the land which has been inhabited by more than one nationality. How you do it on the ground, of course, it creates the problem. The devil is in the detail is in this kind of situation. So the Tashnaks basically said that land distribution should aim at establishing ethnically homogeneous self-governing clusters in Transcaucasia as much as possible. Now, in its 1907 program, the Tashnak party had demanded self-government for Armenia in the Ottoman Empire, but self-government for Transcaucasia in the Russian Empire. At that time, they thought that people were so much living in a mixed manner in Transcaucasia that it was very difficult to separate Armenians, Georgians, and Azerbaijanis, or as they were called at the time, Muslims or Tatars. But now they said after that, as we gradually use land reform, we can gradually lead into areas where there will be, autonomous Armenia, autonomous Georgia, autonomous Azerbaijan, let's say, within the Russian Empire. Although most of them, I think they were thinking more at the even smaller level. There was a Russian word for self-government, zemstvo. And they were basically said, okay, we can have zemstvos for a number of villages who are next to another, and they are inhabited by the same ethnic group, etc. Let's introduce these areas there. In those more contested areas, we will postpone it, etc. So there was this intertwining that was also going on. Unfortunately, it also led into a lot of ethnic cleansing, as we know, as the authority of the central government deteriorated. And it continued up until the Bolsheviks came and basically established their own fist, manu military on the region. And when they left 70 years later, we saw that they had not solved that problem as well, just had frozen it. And ethnic cleansing continued, unfortunately, after 1990 as well. Now, as all these discussions were going on, what happened in October, November 1917 was that in Russia, the Bolsheviks took over power, initially in Petrograd and Moscow. When the news of this revolution came to Transcaucasia, there was no admiration. And Bolsheviks aside, everybody else disliked the Bolsheviks. And all of them refused to follow the orders of Lenin's new government. So technically, that was the beginning of the disentanglement of Transcaucasia from the central Russian state. Russia plunged into its own civil war. Within that context of civil war, Transcaucasia practically became independent, and then it tried to also become formally independent. And that is the process that led into the declaration of the Armenian Republic as well in May 1918. Now, the leading parties in the region, and by now we knew about them because gradually it was becoming clear that which parties were going to win the majority of the seats in Transcaucasia for the Constituent Assembly. They replaced the OZACOM with a new body called the Transcaucasian Commissariat. It would act as an interim regional administration to deal with the numerous pressing problems until, and this is quotation from their own statement, the liquidation of the communist adventure. That they hoped that the Bolshevik rule will be short-lived, things will get back to normal, we'll still be having the Constituent Assembly, and again, Russia will remain a united country, and all the problems will be sorted out in the assembly. The commissariat said that among its various tasks would be immediate organization of democratic land committees and a decree of confiscation in the near future. However, there was one issue which the commissariat went along with the Bolsheviks. When the Bolsheviks decided to sign an armistice with the Central Powers, that is Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, the Transcaucasian Commissariat agreed that there should also be an armistice on the Caucasian front between, of course, the Russian army or the remnants of it and the Ottoman army. And however, the Commissariat would function only for 3 months until February 1918. But even during these 3 months, it issued another very important piece of legislation, which later on was also applied in Armenia. And that was on December the 16th, 1917, just about a month after it had been created. It was called Regulation on Transferring the State, Former Udel Church, Monastic and Judicial Persons and Private Estates to the Land Committees. So it was more a confiscation of the extra land that, some entities possessed. And it was based on the principle of the municipalization of land, because the Georgian deputies carried with them the Muslim deputies, and the Armenian Tashnaks and the Socialist revolutionaries were in the minority. The confiscated lands would constitute the regional land fund, which would be administered by the Transcaucasian regional and provincial land committees. However, this decree did not touch upon the issue of how that confiscated land would in the long run be distributed and exploited. They thought that the way land should be used should still be decided by the Constituent Assembly. But the Armenian Church refused this because it would have made its own land liable to confiscation. Although, as far as I know, this confiscation did not occur during the short trip, but this legal document remained in use for a number of years. I'm going to talk about that, how that happened. Now, of course, the Bolsheviks, although they had power in Petrograd and Moscow, they did allow elections for the Constituent Assembly to occur. And in Transcaucasia, 36 delegates were elected. Actually, every 65,000 voters would give one delegate. And so once they started calculating how many people had participated and who they had voted for, Mensheviks, who were mostly Georgian, came up with 11 delegates. The Musavat were mostly Azerbaijanis, came up with 10 delegates. The Tashnaks came with 9 delegates. The Socialist revolutionaries, who were multi-ethnic and they would have received votes from various nationalities, they got 2. Bolsheviks got 1, and a few others also out of the 36. Now, why I'm giving these details? Because, again, these deputies would serve a very different purpose from what they were elected for because of the continuing political crisis in Russia. The Constituent Assembly actually did convene in January 1918. It met for 1 or 2 days, and then the Bolsheviks, knowing that they were a minority, they just dispersed the Constituent Assembly. So technically, this was the major issue, that this idea that we can keep Russia together through a constitutional changes, etc., that disappeared. And from then on, of course, we have the Civil War, which continues up until 1921, and the Bolsheviks win by the force of arms, but not by any other means. And the Transcaucasian delegates to this assembly basically decided that they should again set up a regional temporary legislature, which act as a government for the region up until we get rid of the Bolsheviks. And we can put things back on the track that were desirable. And they simply decided to multiply by 3 the number of delegates each party had. And so technically there were 33 Mensheviks, 30 Musavat, 27 Tashnaks. The Armenian People's Party did not get 65,000 votes, so it was not represented. But there were Armenians among the social democratic Menshevik, social democratic Socialist revolutionary deputies as well, because, as I said, these parties were multi-ethnic. And of course, the Bolsheviks boycotted. They did not recognize this authority at all. So technically, in the coming months, although in the same, it's the Tashnaks who basically represent Armenian interests, we see that in Armenian life, they are always trying to keep with them the other parties as well. The Armenian national bodies, which did not deal with the land issue, did include also representatives from the populist parties, also social democrats, socialist revolutionaries, and others. So you have to play a double game in this period of crisis. Things got even worse in February 1918, when negotiations were not going well between Bolshevik Russia and the Central Powers. And the Ottomans basically used this opportunity to launch an attack. We know that their desire, we know now that their desire was to reach Baku. Baku at that time was a major oil producer, long before oil was discovered either in Iran or in the Gulf region. At the turn of the century, a few years ago, it produced almost 47% of world's oil, although that percentage was coming gradually down, but still was a major producer. And Baku was in the hands of the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks were supplying oil to Germany and getting money for that. While the Turks basically, although they were the allies of the Germany, the Ottoman Empire wanted the Baku oil for them as well. So ultimately this was the aim. But what it really do is that it put really this Transcaucasian authority, the legislature, the same, under a lot of pressure. Still, on March the 7th, the Sejm adopted another law, which again, based on the earlier commissariat law, is also a very important one. Now, on measure to decide the size of land allotments to be left to landowners and to implement the land reform. In this time, Georgian Armenian deputies, that is Mensheviks and Tashnaks, basically voted together. And now, of course, the legislative base was there to begin the confiscation of land holdings and the transfer to a land fund. Now, they said that, for example, landowners would be allowed to keep anything from 19 to 108 acres, depending on the size. And of course, in some areas that norms could be raised a little. So in a way, that was a next stage of land reform issues actually going to be. It's very interesting when the Turks actually attack, the Sejm publishes a call to arms and actually tells peasants, we are giving you land, for example, go and defend your rights. So that's an incentive for the peasant as well to go and fight for the new life that is awaiting him and his family, after the war is over. And this is, by the way, the flag of the Transcaucasian Federation, which survived only for a month and a few days. Because under Ottoman pressure, they were forced to declare themselves independent in order to negotiate a separate deal from Russia. They were unhappy with the deal that the Russians had struck with the Ottomans. And when they declared themselves independent, the Ottomans demanded even more from them. And ultimately, even that federation basically disintegrated at the end of May. And basically, we had 3 independent republics, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, where a year earlier, nobody was thinking about anything like this, and people were just hoping that, the revolution would just reform Russia, and Russia will remain a unified state. So from the rest of the lecture, we'll deal with this period of the Republic of Armenia, which, as I said, survived for something like 30 months. This is Armenia at the very beginning. It was very small. Actually, of all these borders, the only border between the Ottoman Empire and Armenia was actually regulated by a peace treaty. The other borders that we see of Armenia with Georgia and Armenia with Azerbaijan were disputed. But at the very beginning, and I'm talking about this period from June to December 1918, we think that the size of the Armenian government's control was not more than 10,000 or 11,000 square kilometers. It will gradually grow in 1919, but not that much. I will be talking about that later. The first government that was established, and we should look at the context very well, only Turkey and its allies recognize this country. For the Western allies, Britain and France, this was a deal made with their enemies, so they had no influence at all on this region. And the Bolsheviks, of course, did not accept this. And many of the white armies did not accept it as well, although they were ready to work with them on a de facto basis. So initially, the major concern was just how to handle this very dire situation because of war, famine, etc. And initially, they could not agree on a coalition government, although they attempted to do it. And finally, Tashnak said, okay, we're going to take over responsibility. They were the most powerful party, definitely. And the first government that they formed basically was formed mostly by Tashnak representatives, Tashnak ministers, but no ministers representing other parties. In its program, it does not raise anything about doing land reform. However, during its brief tenure of a few months, it had to deal with a number of land-related issues because these things were coming up. not only the government itself, but also the appointed legislature that was created to do it. But things changed very quickly at the end of the year, end of 1918. The Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, Germany all got defeated. And within this context, this idea was that soon there is a peace conference, everybody has to get ready to get its chunk of the pie, and the Armenians were hoping that they were really getting to get a very big cake for all the suffering that they had undergone during the war, etc. So at this stage, for example, the Tashnaks and the populists came together and formed a government. The reason why the Tashnaks wanted to make a deal with a party which did not have that many followers were two. One, despite their soul smiles, many of these people were very educated professionals. The government needed these people to move from Tiflis to Yerevan to run a state. You need controllers, you need accountants, you need engineers, etc. And you will find a lot of them in this party. They are the bourgeois class. Secondly, the Tashnaks and the Mensheviks had the reputation of being socialist at a time when being socialist in Western Europe was very close to being a right-wing nationalist now, in the sense that a pariah party with whom nobody wants to deal with. The word socialist had a very different meaning in 1919 than it has now. Labour had not been in power in England, the French socialists had never been in power in France, etc. So having this party with them basically will make it that, no, these people are reasonable, we can deal with them, we should not really get very much afraid of them. So that was also a very important play. They also thought that the Armenian bourgeoisie in the diaspora, that thing hasn't changed until now, will give us more money if they show them we are not very crazy socialists. And we need the rich people outside Armenia to contribute to Armenia's development as well. So all these things played. But in order to make a compromise, one of the things when they were negotiating the coalition agreement was that the Tashnaks said, okay, we will postpone land reform until Armenia has its own elected legislative body. So basically they agreed to postpone the issue for a number of months because the populists were not as radical as they were, as I explained, on the issue of land reform. However, one very important thing happened in December 1918. Basically, the parliament had to decide which laws were valid in the country. And they took the same position, which I know in England, have what will happen after Brexit. Well, of course, all the EU law will stay, as long as it has not been changed, that kind of continuity. So essentially, they came to the same idea, that all ancient Tsarist laws will be applied in Armenia unless they were changed by the provisional government, or the Transcaucasian Commissariat, or the Sejm, and if the Armenian government itself, the parliament, changes them again. Now, in this case, of course, the two important texts that we talked about, the regulation by the Transcaucasian Commissariat and the law of March the 7th by the Sejm became applicable in Armenia by this indirect way. They became part of the law. It's very interesting that when this motion was put on in parliament, although the populists were coalition partners with the Tashnaks, they voted against, while the socialist parties like the Mensheviks and the Socialists, which were in opposition, voted with the Tashnak party. So to some extent, the socialist majority imposed socialistic reforms done by the provisional government in Petrograd and in Tiflis on the Armenian society. And especially for the Tashnaks, this is very important. And I want just to diverge here for a moment and talk about something which Tashnaks have stopped talking about, although it's technically part of their history. The divide in the party between diehard nationalists and socialist nationalists, has always been there since the day of the creation, and up until now, to some extent, is there. And at this stage, I think the socialists were quite strong in Armenia. If we were going to classify them, I think Khadisyan, the prime minister, was not. He was much more a liberal person. Vratsian was on the very left wing, and Kachaznouni and Ohanjanian were more towards the left wing. So they were very much in that sense. So they really considered the February Revolution to be their own. To the extent that when Armenia decided which days will be official holidays, and this was in January 1919, leaving all religious feasts aside, which were a lot of them, for Armenians, for Russians, and for the Muslims. The secular laws were, in the text that I've seen, 3. In some other people they say 4, but I don't know how that issue was. But let's take the 4 in that case to err on the safe side. May the 1st was an official holiday. August 1, some people say it was holiday because it's the day of the opening of the parliament. March the 11th or the 13th was a holiday. It was the day of the February Revolution. Initially, May the 28th was not an official holiday, although in 1919, 1920, they marked that by special decree, but it was not in the actual text that was adopted in a way. So it really shows that how important it was an official holiday even in independent Armenia, the day of the Russian Revolution. Not only that, the Tashnag party declared to be its day for adolescents. So all those teenagers who were members of the party or aspiring to become party member, on that day they should have given lectures and other events where party leadership will tell them about the meaning of the February Revolution and how important it was. And if we look back to the newspapers that were published in 1919 and in 1920, you will see party leaders organizing events targeting the youth, especially the teenagers. Badariner, that was the word that they used. And in a way, just to try to encourage them and to learn them. This aspect of the leftism of the Republic's history has gradually been forgotten because in the exile situation after 1920, it ceased to be relevant for the largely urban diasporan youth that were joining the party organization and becoming its active members. In any case, the coalition between the Tashnags and the populists went until early June of 1919. So from November to June. And in the meantime, Prime Minister Kachaznouni decided to go to Europe and America to raise funds for Armenia to seek assistance. And acting Prime Minister became Alexander Khatisyan. However, towards the very end of that coalition agreement, of course, nothing was planned that the coalition agreement will collapse soon. On May the 15th, they gradually started moving towards land reform. And by this time, the date for the first legislative elections had already been set. The law had been passed, etc., and the various parties were getting ready to have the first competitive elections in Armenia at the time. On May the 15th, the Ministry of the Interior approved the regulation to create land committees to implement the past and future agrarian laws until the full implementation of land reform and the approval of new land relations by Armenia's Constituent Assembly. And so now the Armenians thought that their constitution would be adopted by a Constituent Assembly. However, nobody knew when that Constituent Assembly will convene because everybody expected that to happen once Armenia's borders were fixed. So the idea was that Western Armenia will be liberated from Ottoman rule, Eastern Armenia will be liberated from Russian rule, there will be joint Armenia, and only then, of course, there will be said. Everything until then was considered to be temporary, including the flag, including the emblem, and everything else, because it's only then that we will decide everything. We don't know what shape will be, we don't know how many refugees will come, who will settle down, so everything that we're doing is temporary. And you will see that kind of temporary measures prevail so much up until the Bolsheviks come and seize the country. In any case, these committees that were set up by the legislation on May the 15th would commence their task on August the 1st. But of course, in the meantime, elections would be held in June. In June, for reasons that I will not go into, the populists and the Tashnags coalition broke apart. And then the Tashnags remained in sole charge. And as the country was getting ready for elections, they reissued on June 18th of 1919 the March 7th law of the same of the previous year. It was a special government decision to reissue it, saying that it is applied and we are going to deal with this. And during the elections, the Tashnaks won with a landslide. The populists did not participate. They boycotted the elections. We don't know how many votes they would have gotten had they got elected. But in the end, we had a parliament dominated by the Tashnak party. 72 deputies out of 80 were from the same party. So technically, in a way, all the problems went to inside the party rather than at the weight of the legislature. Khadisian formed a new government consisting only of Tashnaks, not a coalition government, and it pledged to continue with land reform. And its land committees began operating. And look at these districts. Unfortunately, I don't have a map. Yerevan, Echmiadzin, Darlagyaz, which is Vayotsor, Alexandropol, which is Gyumri. These are not the cities, they are the regions. Karakilisa, which is Vanadzor, Dilijan, Norbayazet, which is today Kavar, and Surmalu. We always debate how big Armenia was. Yeah? And sometimes things like 70,000 square kilometers are given. I have heard 47,000, etc. We should be very careful about these numbers, so that because we should compare apples with apples, not apples with oranges. Because some of these were contested areas, which at certain cases were under Armenian control. At other cases, they were under Turkish or Azerbaijani or Georgian control, etc. So it really depends on how you calculate it. I think this is another measure where you see that you're safe. And I will compare it, I didn't have the time, where actually elections were held, in which districts, in which areas they could not take place. For example, one of the reasons the populists said we will not participate in the elections is because Armenians in Nakhichevan and Karabakh will not be able to participate in it, etc. That was it argued. But you basically see that if we take Surmalu aside, all the areas are within today's borders of Armenia. So this was that crunch area where the Armenian government had control, and then the Bolsheviks actually inherited it. They even did not do it in Kars, which is, I'm surprised, because I think Armenians had quite much of a control, at least on the city of Kars. I don't know how much on the villages, etc. So these things have to be studied better in order to understand the real essence of what actually having power and being part of Armenia is. And then, of course, the work of these committees proceeded very slowly because of famine, refugee congestion, and rebellions in certain areas where Muslim villagers didn't want to abide by the regulations of the Armenian government. From now on, we will never talk about the populists because they will never again come back to power. They will remain an opposition party. But it's very important that they remained committed to the concept of independent Armenia. They despised the Bolsheviks as much as the Tashnaks did. There was no difference on that issue. And they basically were still, of course, hoping that they would return to power one day. So in September 1919, even when they were in opposition, they held their second party conference. The first one had been in Tiflis in the first year in 1917. 2 years later, they did it in Yerevan. They brought the headquarters from Tiflis to Yerevan. They also adopted a new party program in order to make it more appealing to the new conditions when Armenia was an independent country, and also introduced changes in the way they would approach the land reform program. So this is much more theoretical because they were not part of the government, but it just shows that even the opposition was still taking that issue seriously when it was in opposition, hoping to come back to power one day in an Armenia which was thought to be democratic with competitive elections in the future. However, even more ominous for the Republic was the Bolshevik successes. And at the late 1919, early 1920, the Bolsheviks were on the doors of Transcaucasia. And under this situation, it became very urgent for Armenians to also defend themselves. And one way in which some Tashnaks said that we should actually do many of the reforms that the Bolsheviks are promising, otherwise the Armenians basically will be attracted to Bolshevism. And one of them was Arshak Jamalian, who was a member of the party's highest executive body, the Bureau. In a public speech, he went outside the brief and said things that were not acceptable to the party's leadership, to the extent that they reprimanded him and basically said that you have to apologize and say that what you said is not the party's policy, and he was even suspended for 1 month from participating in the meetings of the executive. But this whole idea that we should go forward urgently, do this land reform thing because the peasants are waiting for us to do that land reform was an important moment. Then comes, of course, the Bolshevik rebellion in Armenia in May 1920. It was crushed, but yet again it introduced a sense of urgency to make another wave of land confiscation and temporary reallocation. At this time again, when the government took this decision on June the 4th, we have, at that time the minister was Simon Vratsian, and he was basically saying the same thing. Many of the Russians and the peasants were with the Bolsheviks because we are not doing reforms fast enough for them. So yet again, these committees worked in roughly the same region as before: Yerevan, Echmiadzin, Dilijan, Alexandropol, Sharur Daralagyaz. And then, of course, the government also tried to use land reform in order to score points on the nationalistic level, to weaken the economic base of the relatively well-provisioned Russian villagers and Muslim villagers who had sympathized with the Armenian Bolshevik rebels in May. There is a very interesting letter which the Prime Minister sends to the Ministry of Defense and asks, where should we start the reforms? So basically, that they also saw it as some kind of a strategic way of increasing the power of the Armenian element at the expense of the non-Armenian element. That nationalism was becoming a very thorny issue in the area, and the idea of having democratic states which observe the rights of everybody irrespective of race and other things were being questioned by almost everybody. In any case, even this land of reform was stopped in mid-October because in September it was the Turkish Kemalist invasion of Armenia. And gradually I did not find any document that after mid-October these committees continued working. By the end of October, Kars is occupied by the Kemalists, and of course a month later Armenia became Sovietized. Just a few weeks after coming to power, the Bolsheviks nationalized the land. But yet again, they had made a lot of concessions to socialization. So in a way, I don't know if anybody has actually compared what the Tashnaks intended to do and what the Bolsheviks actually did. Well, I'll come to that. I don't think they were that much different, at least when it came to the land issue. The Republic of Armenia collapsed before its borders could be finalized and before its Constituent Assembly convened. So as you see, most of what they did was confiscating the land, sometimes giving it to peasants, some kind of an agreement, like leasing the land for a year or two or whatever, but they never took any decision about what kind of land reform to implement. A formal law was never passed between 1918 and 1920. Most measures were interim, and they were overwhelmingly an extension of the road paved by the February 1917 revolution. You cannot understand what happened in Armenia unless you realize that it's a byproduct of that revolution. So in that sense, the history of the Republic is also part of the history of the Russian Revolution, as much as Armenians want to now see it separately as a kind of national rebirth. Moreover, until the collectivization of agriculture in the Soviet Union, in Armenia by Stalin in the late 1920s, the Soviet land policies in Armenia were not very different from those of their Tashnak predecessors, in the sense of redistribution once every few years, etc. They nationalized the land, but left other means of production in private hands. However, the Bolsheviks were unprepared to note anything positive during the Tashnak-dominated era in Armenia. And the Tashnaks never were ready to say that the Bolsheviks were doing a good thing. So that kind of rhetoric should not necessarily basically force us to accept it, and I'll call on somebody to do research. Probably they will find much more than I have had. Perhaps a person who is more expert on agrarian things will find more, but I think that this is an issue that we have to go back again. In the meantime, and this is my last slide, I think, the Tashnak leaders were forced into exile. They were obliged to adjust their politics to overwhelmingly urban settings in the diaspora and work with a younger generation forcibly alienated from the land. One other thing that we have missed in our history of diaspora, especially in the history of Lebanon and Syria, is that up until the 1930s, there was so much attempt to revitalize Armenian peasant life in Lebanon and Syria. If you look at the newspapers of that period, you read a lot of articles about this. And both the Tashnags and Ramgavars all liked this idea. Even in the Sanjak of Alexandretta, a few Armenian villages were established, but then quickly abandoned when the French actually left. So they had a life of only a few years, 3 or 4 years. In Iraq, for example, there was a whole idea of Havresk, that Armenian village that was created, etc. So there was an attempt that we have lost most of these refugees are peasants. They have their skills, and they're not using their skills. But ultimately, this did not really, was not implemented, and the society became quickly urbanized. And its interest in everything agrarian, even history, was dropped because people did not live in that village agrarian setting. Agrarian reform issues suddenly seemed remote and uninteresting, not only to their followers, but also to their leaders. While if you look at the books of Khadisyan and Vratsian, especially Vratsian, who was the Minister of Agriculture for some time, you see that they write in detail about these. And not only I used their books when I was doing this study, but also sometimes found the actual document, which was paraphrased by Vratsian later on in his book. If you look at the next level of popularizing the Republic of Armenia, which is the special issues that Tashnak newspapers publish every year on May the 28th, the public lectures that they conduct, if you look at what they say, you will not find anything about village life. You will find about, the courts were Armenized, Armenian language was brought here, this. So it's other aspects of what they did, which was emphasized. We're not talking much about, what they were trying to do with the 80% peasant population of their own community. And this is basically why I think this issue has been ignored. I was just trying with this work and with these lectures, and hopefully now that it will go online within a few weeks, to also remind that there are aspects of the history of Armenia that we are actually have come to ignore for reasons that are the byproduct of the context rather than whether they were important or unimportant in their own time. Thank you very much.
We now have time for questions. I've got a microphone here. So by a raise of hands, we'll take, I think we should do 2 or 3 questions at a time, just to allow enough time for the answers. So one question here, and one at the back. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Tremendous lecture,
yes,
very enlightening and
yeah.
very extremely interesting. I mean, the complexity of the context. I've never heard before such an exposition of the complexity of the context. It's well done. Fantastic. Congratulations. When you say that the Tashnak leaders were forced into exile,
Yeah.
Can you clarify that more? I mean, were they physically forced into exile, or
I
was
would
it
say yes.
voluntarily
No, I will say yes.
by
No.
themselves or something?
No,
I mean, who forced them? How were they
I would say
forced?
the Bolsheviks forced them. And
But in what
Yeah,
means
yes.
and how,
Yeah.
etc. Thank you
Well,
very
this has
much.
nothing to do with land reform issue. The Tashnaks actually ceded power to the Bolsheviks by a treaty. In that treaty, it was said that they will not be physically harmed. However, soon disagreements emerged within the Bolshevik party. And there were also moderates and radicals there as well. So I think what is important is what the radicals used to say here. The radicals used to say that the bourgeoisie, and for them the Tashnak party was the bourgeoisie. The Tashnaks would have not accepted that, but would never cede its power voluntarily unless you break their head. And so basically, we cannot trust them, we have to imprison them, etc., to make sure that the proletarian revolution will be successful. And a lot of people were actually arrested. And when the February Rebellion happened, some of them were actually killed in jail before the actual, the Tashnag rebellious units could come and take over Yerevan. But when the Bolsheviks came back, and basically most of them actually fled Armenia. A few Tashnag, these not very prominent ones, did live in Armenia. Some did not survive Stalin's purges, but Stalin's purges should not be put into this context because many Bolsheviks died for that. Others didn't, but most of the leadership basically fled. They went to Tabriz, most of them initially, and from Tabriz they spread to many parts of the world, and ending up mostly in the Middle East, but initially mostly in Paris, etc. So I will say yes, they were forced because their life was under physical threat, and they could have been arrested at any moment simply for being a Tashnag, the way how the incoming Bolshevik party actually dealt with them. And now, this is slightly different with the People's Party. Fewer of them fled, and many of them actually, and I will do that on a separate research hopefully, many of them did stay in Armenia for years, but because they were professionals, they could easily work in the government. Many of them became university professors, etc. They were on that kind of loyal bourgeois specialists for most of the Tashnags, probably that was difficult and not a choice given to them. Having in mind that initially there was a lot of, anger toward the Tashnags among the radical elements in the Bolshevik party. So I will say that forced into exile is a term that I can comfortably defend if somebody says why.
First, of course, congratulations on a wonderful speech. I just wondered, as a complete outsider to history as well as social aspects, whether communism offered the possibility of all the nationalities living in harmony, which the Dashnags didn't.
The communists basically presented themselves as such. And their idea was that they brought peace into an area where there had been lots of inter-ethnic violence among Armenians, Georgians, and Azerbaijanis. To what extent they did? Well, it's very difficult to say because, as I said, in the end they could not solve the issue. We know that once Moscow's power got weaker in the region in the late 1980s, many of these inter-ethnic clashes came back again, sorry. And today, Caucasus is one of the most nationalistic parts of the world, yeah? In the sense that we feel that in every aspect of life. And what is true for Armenia is largely true for Georgia and Azerbaijan. Differences are percentage dosage, but in essence, we have a very strong nationalistic environment and inter-ethnic rivalries and mutual suspicions. The Bolsheviks thought they had brought peace, but ultimately they had created a system which had actually silenced those dissent rather than finding a long-term solution for them. However, they tried a lot. They tried a lot and all their compromise solutions were never acceptable to the radicals on either side. Whether they would allow refugees to come back or not to come back to their own villages, they have been forced out because of their ethnic or religious identity. All this in the 1920s was a major issue that they tried to do it. Trying to find out middle-of-the-way solutions like the Karabakh. Okay, we'll make it autonomous within Azerbaijan. Maybe that will work, etc. So all of these were part of the attempt. One of the things that I remember one of my professors when I used to study in Armenia used to say is that the Bolsheviks in the Transcaucasia were probably the only party, maybe the Socialist revolutionaries were as well, who had members from all ethnicities among them. So you had Muslim Bolsheviks, you had Armenian Bolsheviks, you had Georgian Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks had been very much dominated by the Georgians, and Armenians and Muslims rarely joined the Menshevik party. So that was a bit of an advantage. But even that was a big problem because we saw that when it comes to issues like Karabakh and the others, they had to sell their decisions back in their own areas, Armenia, Azerbaijan, to a largely nationalistic audience. And so in that sense, they had to take upon themselves the role of the previous Musavat, Tashnag, and Menshevik leaders as they were trying to sort out how the borders would be. This idea that communism will bring in an era of prosperity so that people will stop thinking about their national identity. An EU before its time, yeah? In a way, EU is not working perfectly now, let alone Bolsheviks trying to do something very similar to make borders irrelevant, etc., to pay attention to individual, education, wealth, etc., and tie it from this link that you have to your own nation and tie it into a much broader entity. They tried these things, but in the end, as I said, they were unsuccessful, and they have been very much now being criticized by nationalistic forces who are actually criticizing them from a nationalistic viewpoint and rejecting all their internationalist agenda that they once had.
How aggressive were they in the educational sphere? In the educational sphere?
Educational?
Yeah, of getting children growing up together from different ethnic backgrounds.
No, they didn't do that much of that because, at least in the Transcaucasus, they encouraged initially education in the local languages. And so that was a big difficulty. I think teaching them to be good communists in Armenian, in Turkish, in Georgian became much more important than bringing them together and teaching them in which language? Russian. The early Bolsheviks were not Russian nationalists. They started becoming Russian nationalists more in the 1930s. And that's a very important. It's under Stalin that they became more and more, towards Russian nationalism. As far as I know, they were not. But there were a lot of respect towards languages. For example, if you look at very ancient photos from Yerevan or from Baku, you would see announcements in Armenian and in Azerbaijan in both cases. For example, when I went to study in Armenia in 1985, you never saw any Azerbaijani sign, although 10% of the population of the Republic was Azerbaijan. It was only Armenian and Russian. When you went to Baku, you never saw Armenian signs. But if you look at pictures from the 1920s and 30s, and we study them more, you will see that these kind of things were more. That period of 1920s has to be restudied in the Soviet period. It's very interesting, and I really hope that in 2 years' time, when there is the 100th anniversary of the sovietized nation of Armenia, we may have a few conferences and also deal with that period.
To what extent was the cooperation or lack of cooperation thereof on the issue of land reform between Mensheviks, Dashnaks and Musavat before the Bolsheviks took over?
The Musavats were not socialists. Usually in Armenian and Georgian literature, they are actually accused of being land reforms, landowners, etc. But again, we have to study them much more. And outside the Azerbaijani language, there isn't much, unfortunately. As I said, when it came to the issue of land reform, there was a division between municipalization and socialization. So there wasn't much cooperation. But since the ideological grounding came roughly from the same positions, so there was a lot of overlap in what they were trying to do. Of course, there's a huge difference between being a social democrat, Menshevik or Bolshevik, who believed that ultimately industrialization will kill the peasantry as a class in its own right, while the socialist revolutionaries, which idealized village life as being the ideal system. So even in the Tashnak's understanding of socialism, you don't have this idea that sooner or later this big that the history of England will repeat itself in every other place. Large factories will come and village life basically will be destroyed the way we know it, which is basically what Marx's belief was. The Tashnaks did not have that. They didn't have that kind of a vision of how society will develop within 100, 200 years, etc. They thought that actually you need not necessarily have to tie it with industrialization. You can just really have a more efficient village life and agricultural production by empowering those village communes and redistributing land evenly among them. The Tashnaks and the socialist revolutionaries in Armenia cooperated with one another because the socialist revolutionaries were only questioning Armenia's readiness to secede from Russia. And also sometimes they criticize the Tashnaks for not keeping their word and, not forcing their ideological statements into action on the ground. But all governments have that problem, and so it's very easy to criticize the government when you're outside the government of not being very radical. Well, you have power in your own hands. You have to take hundreds of other factors into consideration. For example, on the issue of why the Tashnak Party is not confiscating the land of the church was raised a number of times by the socialist revolutionaries. But the church land, there was discussion. There are letters, actually, with the Catholicos protesting that our land should not be taken over. The government had not actually done a concession on this issue. It was still committed, but actually had not started confiscating. Then the Bolsheviks came in, of course. Basically, they tried to destroy the church up until the 1930s. And from the 1940s, they allowed a minimal church, especially to be used, mostly in the Armenian case, for the diaspora, rather than for them. But that's a separate story. Okay, thank you very much for being and for your interesting questions. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.